Back again, and welcome back to another video within the coding workshop. And in today's video, we're going to quickly go back over but look at what we did with the data table components. I'm going to try and actually get it to work within our Twig template and try and display it on the screen so you guys can see what it looks like. Then we're going to go on to adding our pagination and finishing off or sorting within another video after this one. But before I do that, also I made some changes in order to sort of like get this video up and running and just jump straight into it, get ready to go. So, and these are stuff that I've done off screen before I've started the recording, just to sort of like save some time. And I'm going to show you what I've done so you know exactly what changes I've made and how they reflect on what we're doing or how they affect what we're doing. So we're going to jump straight into it, and we're going to go into our Magma core directory, because if you look at the last video where I created a method that I said I need to recreate it, and I'm going to open up my liquid ORM and I'm going to go to the data repository, and if I open that file up, we created this method in our lot. Let me just close that down for a little bit. We created this method right here where we're passing this to our controller class, and this is returning a bunch of different results for our data table component to loop through it and display that data appropriately. And we created a method called, well, we created this external method that returns an amount of record based on certain conditions, and we created this count records method that I said I didn't created it yet, and we're going to do that. So I've done this off screen, and I'm going to walk you through it because there are some other changes that I had to make in order for this to work. So we're going to go through those quickly, then we're going to go and try and display those data within the data table in our view template so you guys can see what it's doing or how it's doing it. Right, so I'm going to take it to this method first, and that is located within our entity management directory. So if I open that up, and let me start with the interface first, because I've added two methods within the interface which we need to look at, which is this aggregate method, and I will explain that in a little bit, and the count records method. And you can see that both of them takes in a couple of arguments. Like the aggregate, that takes in 3 arguments: a type, field, and a conditions. And the count records method takes in 2 arguments. It's got a conditions and a field which is set to ID by default. Right, so that's the 2 method that I have added in, and I'm going to show you the implementation. So if I open up the CRUD class, we scroll down to the bottom where I've defined these methods, and if we get the aggregate method, close that down, and you can see it's pretty much doing exactly what we were doing before in terms of we creating this array of key value pairs. We're passing in the primary key, which is the get schema ID, passing in the table, which is the get schema method, and we're using the type, which is a select. But you can see that we've added some new key, one called aggregate and one called aggregate field, right? And I'm going to show you where those are defined in a minute. But you can see it's pretty much the same as what we've done up top with all of our other methods. We call in the data mapper, we call in the persist method, the build query parameters method, and then we're going to be calling the column method, which is also our next method that I have added in, and I will show you that very quickly because it's very, very simple. So that's what this aggregate is doing. And what the aggregate is, it's a MySQL function which we can use to retrieve value by performing some sort of calculation. And the function we are using within this count records is the count function within MySQL. So we can actually retrieve a count of, retrieves a count of the number of rows returned, right? So we can hard code that because this is what this method is doing. It's only returning one function, which is this count function. So we can hard code it. And there's several other aggregate function in MySQL, like average, min, max. But for this method, we are only interested in the count function, which is what we specified right here. And you can see that for the second argument, which is the ID, we could have just passed in that field, but we've actually made it dynamic by passing in this get schema ID, because effectively that method is returning an ID or a field that is set by the model. And I'm going to show you where this is being set from. So if I scroll up to the application directory, and within the model, the user model, you can see that we've defined a table schema ID, which is ID, and a table schema, which is the users, which is the database table where all that data is stored. And we've got the primary key for that table, which is ID, right? And all we've done is just pass that in straight into this aggregate method as the second argument. Again, we could have used the fields, but we made it more dynamic by using this method, this get schema ID method, which effectively return a string ID, right? Let's close that back down a bit, and we're passing in the conditions from the argument. And yeah, so that's a tool method that I've added in, and this is the implementation. So I'm going to show you what else I modify where these are being used. If I go into my query builder and I open up the query builder.php file, if I go down to the select query, I have also modified that a bit, and I've thrown in an if statement to say that if we're using aggregate, let's use this query right here with the aggregate fields, else just return the normal query that was there before. That is it. That's all I've done within the query builder class, just to make use of those two methods that we've added in, right? Let's close that. So that's the two method that we've added in from what I've discussed in the last video, and we're using that within our data repository class to get the number of records based on a particular conditions, right? So that's the massive changes that I've made within, well, since the last video, and I just want to go over those to show you what I've done, so you're not confused as to what's that. I've not seen that before, right? And I've declared the interface as well, the method in the interface class, because these are methods that if we're going to rebuild this class, we need to implement all those methods, because all of them make up the complete function of our data table. And if I take it to the data mapper class, I'll show you where I've added in that columns method. And again, we start off with the interface, and I drag it down to the bottom, and I've just put in a public function, which is a column, and that's going to return mixed value, right? So I've just set it. I've not set a return type, and you notice that I've not been using any PHP 8 new functions, because I'm using VS Code at the moment, and that's, at this time of speaking, is lacking support for PHP 8. So I'm having a little think whether I should change out and use PHP Storm or stick to VS Code. But I'm going to stick to VS Code for the time being and see if any updates come to it, because I want to actually get on to using some of those PHP 8 new features. At the moment, I'm going to get errors if I do that, because VS Code at this current time is not yet supporting PHP 8. So let's wait and see what happens there. So that's the method that the count method that I've implemented in the interface, and the implementation is in the data mapper class, which is a simple method which only returns this fetch column. You see, it's quite similar to what I've done before with the results and the result method. We're just returning fetch column, right? That is it. And that is what we're calling in our count records or aggregate method. I think we're calling that columns. Where is it? In entity manager, in our CRUD class, we're calling that a method right here, column, which is going to return a value for us. So with all that said, that's all the changes I've made. I'm going to take you to the application directory. I'm going to build these out and see if we could get our data table to show the data that we want. Right, so if we come up to our, let's close that down for a bit, come back up to our controller class, we're going to go into our home controller for testing purposes, and this is where we left off last time. So the first thing I want to do is to get that repository, right? So I'm going to say repository equal user, and this user is referencing this user model object. So I'm going to say user, and on that object we can call that get repo method. So I'm going to say get repo, and within that repository I want to call that method that we created in the last video, which is that find with search and pagination or paging. So it's going to be find with search and paging, just like that. And this method takes in two arguments, which is, if you scroll over it, you see that it pops up, and the first argument is the object, and the second is an array of arguments, and that object is the request object, and it's that what we created from using our Symfony component. We created a wrapper class for that object, for that request object, and we're going to pass this in as the first argument. So I'm to say parentheses new request handler, right? Then on the outside bracket I'm going to call that method handler, just like that, because that's the method that we've got in that class that brings that object in. And the second argument is going to be args, which is this args right here, which is bringing in that YAML file containing all of those parameters for our user controller, right? So we'll pass that in. So the next thing we need to do is to get our data table. So I'm going to create a next variable called table data, to say equal new, or parentheses new data table, and on that I want to call that create method, because that's the first method that we have to call, right? And this method takes in a couple of arguments, and you can see on the screen right here, it takes in data column, which is the user column that we've created. It takes in that repository that we've just done a while ago, and it also takes in those controller.yaml configuration, right? So I'm going to pass in that user columns, which is this user columns right here, which returns this array of data that is mapped to each of our fields in our database table, right? And we don't have to call this method because we've already called the method, just passing in a reference to the class. So it's going to be as simple as user columns : class, and that second argument is this repository that we've just created a while ago. So I'm going to pass that in as repository, and the third argument is also going to be args, which is coming from that control.yaml configuration files, just like so. So forget that, because there's a couple of methods that we need to call onto this create method as well, right? And we've got two options. And if you go back to what I've just said a while ago with this set attribute, we can call this set attribute method, and we can change some of the attributes for our table, like ID, class, etc. So we don't have to. We can just simply call table, right? And that will just print our table and print any default attribute that we've already set. So if we look back into our abstract data table class, you can see we've got table class and table ID, which is empty. We've not set nothing yet, but I'm going to demonstrate the default and demonstrate how we can set attributes in our controller class to override those defaults, right? So at the moment, this is near enough ready to sort of like display that data on our screen. So we're going to do that right now. So I'm going to pass, just clear this out, and I'm going to pass in table, and I want to pass in that table data variable that we've just created, because this now contains our data table object with all the values that we need to print out that data to our screen. So I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to refresh and see what data we're going to get, or if we're going to get any error or so. So I'm going to change my screen now, and you can see we've got some data that we were displaying from one of our last videos. So if I open up my Twig template file or index file, you can see we've got this in. We're going to clear that out, and we're going to pass in our table, which is what we've just created down here, passing in that key, which is going to render that value right here. So if I reload this page, you see we're getting our data straight away. It's already in a table format and it's just printing it out. And you can see we've defined all of this within our user columns class, and I can demonstrate something to show you so you can see that it's actually coming from this particular class. So you can see I've got the file open up, and I can change this row which says ID, which is what you're seeing on your screen, right? You can see, I'm just increase this for you a bit, I'll decrease it back, which you can see on your screen right here. And if I change ID to something else, you'll see that the changes is being made from this particular file. So if I say UID, not massive, let's reload that page. You can see it's saying UID now. So all changes to our table can be made from this file. We can say checkbox, anything, because this is effectively what we're going to be putting, where we're going to put in our checkbox in within this ID column. Checkbox. Again, we can make changes however we want. We can hide or show the column. By default, we're showing the column. If I change it to false, you see that it disappears completely, and that's completely gone, right? So we can manipulate our table from this particular class. Set that back to true, and let's try our sortable. Let's set that to true and see what happens. Reload the page. You can see this becomes a link. It's now clickable, but I don't think it will work because there's other parts that we need to like finish setting up, like our router, for this to work properly. But if I click it, you can see that it doesn't really work, right? But we will get back to that in the next video. So go back. We don't normally make ID column sortable. So again, it was just a test to see if it works, and you can see that it works. So if I open up the sources, and you can see the data that's being built, being printed out, you can see that we've added a link tag around this ID column. If I set that to false, you see that it disappears. Reload. You see, it's just a normal ID tag. There's no anchor tag wrapped around it anymore, right? So what we need to do, right, so we've got first name that is being linked by default. Yeah, sorry, I was looking at this, I was thinking what's going on right here. But if you remember, we've got default sortable column, and I will show that to you. And that's coming from our config file. If I open up the controller.yaml, you can see we've got some sortable column by default which we have set, and the first name is part of that, which is why you're seeing the first name being linked. Yeah, so we got the first name which is coming from our default, so we've set that by default, right? So I was wondering why have I got a link right there, but I remember that we've got default that which we've set for columns to be sortable, and we can change that from this class if we want, or change it from the YAML config file. So we've got our data, we can manipulate it. What else can we do? There's loads we can do on here, but again, I will go into more details when we come to fixing up our sorting and adding on our pagination and finish off this component so we can then move on to something else, right? But this is basically what I wanted to show. If we're going to be getting our data back, and we have, and quickly show you back into our controller as well, because we won't be doing it in our final class. We won't be doing it like this, where we're sort of like creating an object within the method. We're going to be using dependency injection to inject these objects within this class, and we're going to be using properties to declare or call the method that we want within an object. So this is like for demonstration purpose only, but we won't be doing it in our final class. We won't be doing it like this. You know, we've got a lot of better way of doing it. So just to point that out, right? Think if there's anything else that I need to show. yeah, so I want to show you the attributes bit that we can override. So if we come back down to this method right here, before we call table, we can call a set attribute method, right? And if I open up my source page again, you can see, scroll over, you can see by default we got ID and we got class, which is empty. So if we go and set those default first, and I will demonstrate how we can override them. So if we go into our abstract data class, data table, we can define some defaults. So if I say a class, we're going to say UK table, and for an ID, we're going to say data table. Save that, reload. Now you can see we got those defaults being printed out, right? So if I go back to my, let's close these down. Go to my controller, and before we call the table method, we can call set attr, right? And then call our table method. And within this, we can define an array, and we can override those defaults. So I'm going to override the table ID, and I'm going to call it sexy table, something like that. Save it, reload. You can see now we're getting that sexy table because we're now overriding those default by calling this set attribute method before our table, and that gets validated as well. So if I pass in true, we're going to get an error, right? We've got an error, and it says, let's go back onto this screen. It says invalid argument type 1 should be a string, and we've actually defined those validation within our abstract class. And we're saying down here, we're saying if table ID is not a string, then we're going to throw an exception, which is what we're doing on your screen right now, right? So we're passing in that validation method right here, just so if we're using this method within our controller, we want the values you're passing in or the keys to be valid, or else we're going to throw an exception, right? So just to point that out, so if we set that back to what it was before, and we can define or declare some more, we can say class, and this class takes in an array of values. So we can say table class, again generic. If we go back to our page, reload, right? So we got an error, says invalid property key, right? Because we've got no key or no key that's called class. If I take it back to my abstract data table, you see we've got table class, we haven't got class. So again, we're sort of like detecting errors and throwing exception where we pick up any errors. So if I change that to table class, let's change it to something else. Let's say YouTube data table. That's our class name. Let's reload. Data is back. Let's reload this source. You can see we're getting YouTube data table because that's what we've just wrote or override within our own controller class. So there you go. We got validation. We got our data table in a nice format. We can style it however we want. We're going to be adding on our paging and our sortable links properly in our next video, and you can see we got some empty class. Again, these are coming from the columns table, the columns class that we've got, and we can pretty much set a class. If we scroll up, we can set a class. This is, just gonna say ID class, reload. You can see that it changes to ID class. Again, we can manipulate this table however we want, right? And we can make this dynamic by passing in the actual ID of. And again, you can see that we're getting all the data because we've done all the hard work. We're getting all the values back through that find and search, or find with pagination and search method. I might have called that wrong, but we're getting all that data back. We can manipulate it, and in the next video, we're going to continue adding our pagination and fixing our sortable links and completing off this component and moving on to actually getting to the end to build a fully fledged application from it. So that's it, guys. Thanks for watching. Like and share the video. Subscribe to the channel if you've not already done so. And thanks for everyone who's already subscribed. I really appreciate it. Keep watching. Keep getting value. If you are, post down into the comment. Let me know what you like. Or let me know what you don't like, and we can go from there. But thanks for watching, and see you in the next video. Thanks and bye.